The woman from the Homeowners Association was explaining, in a tone she probably reserved for code violations and slow children, that the structure currently attached to the front of Unit 14 was, quote, architecturally inconsistent with the aesthetic vision of Harbour Crest. She had a clipboard. She had a lanyard. She had the particular confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about anything, because she had arranged her life so that no one had ever been allowed to tell her so. Marcus Delaney stood in his doorway and listened to all of this. Kiper, his black Labrador, sat beside him in a yellow harness, ears politely forward. Marcus had learned, over 54 years of living and 2 of them in complete darkness, that silence made certain people uncomfortable enough to fill it with things they would later regret saying. He waited. "We're going to need you to remove it," Cynthia Folt said, "or the association will be compelled to take action." Marcus said, "Have a good evening," and closed the door. He had moved to Harbour Crest that October, arriving with 2 duffel bags, a crate of files, and Kiper on a leash. The complex sat on the western edge of Ashtabula, Ohio, where Lake Erie spent 9 months a year looking like hammered pewter, and the wind came off the water with the personality of something that had never forgiven anyone for anything. The Victorian-era townhouses had been converted and renovated in the early 2000s by a developer who had since been indicted for something unrelated, and what remained was a collection of handsome brick facades arranged around a central courtyard that the HOA newsletter called a gathering space for community excellence, and which mainly contained 2 dead planters and a bench no one used. Marcus had served 22 years in the U.S. Army, the last 12 of them as an actuarial analyst for the Army's Casualty and Compensation Division. He had spent those years calculating probabilities. How many soldiers from a given deployment would require long-term care, what the pension liability looked like across 5 cohorts, what it cost, statistically, to send a man to Fallujah and bring back a version of him that needed a great deal of help. He had been moderately good at the work. He had been very good at reading documents. The IED that caught his convoy in 2004 had not killed him. It had given him a traumatic brain injury, 3 surgeries, and a slow, grinding deterioration of his optic nerves that the VA doctors described with the careful vagueness of people who did not want to be wrong. By 2019, wrong was no longer an option. The light was gone. He had notified the HOA in writing, 3 weeks before move-in, that he would be installing a wheelchair-accessible entry ramp and that he had a certified service animal. The letter went certified mail, return receipt. He had the green card. No response came back, which he had noted and filed and treated, provisionally, as a cent. The ramp went in on a Monday, installed by a licensed contractor who charged him $2,800 and did the work properly. Kiper had never bitten anyone, never lunged, never done anything except guide a blind man through the world with quiet competence. 10 days later, the first fine arrived. $150 for an unsanctioned exterior structure. Marcus read the notice through his screen reader, then read the HOA bylaws, and then sat very still for a moment. The architectural uniformity clause the fine cited had been added to the governing documents 3 months earlier. His lease had been signed 4 months earlier. He requested the amendment records. The association sent him a PDF of the clause without the supporting documentation. He noted that too. The formal approval application went out on a Tuesday, certified mail, with a full set of drawings his contractor had provided. The HOA bylaws required a written response within 21 days. Day 22 came and went. Day 30 arrived with a second fine, $200 for a dog over 25 pounds. Kiper weighed 68. Marcus appeared at the next open board meeting, which was held in the common room of the complex and attended by 6 residents, 3 board members, and a property manager named Gerald, who looked like he would rather be literally anywhere else. Cynthia Folt sat at the center of the folding table with the clipboard and the lanyard and a set of printed rules she clearly knew by heart. She explained that his application was incomplete. Missing an architectural rendering to scale 1:50. He submitted it 2 weeks later. Then he wrote a letter, 2 pages, single-spaced, to the board. He cited the Fair Housing Act. He cited the Americans with Disabilities Act. He cited the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504. He was specific about subsections. He had, after all, spent 12 years reading federal regulations for the government. Cynthia's response arrived on HOA letterhead and was 4 sentences long. The association respected the law. The association had rules for all residents. The association was confident in its legal position. She signed it with a fountain pen. $300. New fine. Unsanctioned exterior structure, ongoing. The man Marcus met at the mailbox cluster that Thursday was named René Augustin, 71 years old, Haitian-born, retired paralegal with a civil rights firm in Cleveland, who had moved to Harbour Crest because it was affordable and because he liked to watch the lake. He wore a cardigan. He had the measured, deliberate quality of someone who had spent decades in rooms where words had consequences. "You said fair housing," René said, after Marcus had given him the short version. "I did." René was quiet for a moment. "Let me look at that amendment." Marcus was in Cleveland when they took the ramp. The surgery was routine, as these things went. A cochlear implant evaluation, follow-up imaging, the ordinary bureaucratic management of a body that had been significantly rearranged by an explosion 2 decades earlier. He had been gone 4 days. Kiper had stayed with Priscilla Voigt, who lived in Unit 9 and was a veterinarian, and who had, upon learning about the fines, said several things that Marcus had not heard from anyone since his last deployment. He came back on a Friday evening in November. Kiper was with him, back in harness, and they came up the front walk together the way they always did, Kiper slightly ahead, Marcus with his hand resting lightly on the harness grip. The dog stopped. 7 inches of exposed concrete lip at the threshold. The ramp was gone. Marcus stood there. He could hear the wind off the lake, and a television somewhere in the building, and the distant sound of a cargo vessel on the water. He felt Kiper lean very slightly against his leg, which was something the dog did when he sensed a problem he could not fix. "All right," Marcus said. Priscilla had seen them from her window. She came down in a coat thrown over her scrubs, took one look at the entrance, and used language that would have gotten her fired from 3 different jobs. She helped Marcus get inside, guided him over the lip with her hand under his arm. She was shaking slightly, and it was not from the cold. Marcus dictated a voice memo. Date, time, condition of entry, names of witnesses. Then he asked Priscilla to take photographs. René came by an hour later. He had already been looking at contractor records on the county assessor's website, where permitted work was publicly filed. The crew that had removed the ramp had pulled a permit under the name of a company called Lakefront Property Services, LLC. The owner of record was a man named Todd Greer. Todd Greer was the nephew of board member Dale Fish. "Conflict of interest," René said, in the tone of a man reading a grocery list. "Bill me $1,100 for the removal," Marcus said. "How much did it actually cost?" "I don't know yet." "We'll find out," René said. The next morning, René sat across from Marcus at the kitchen table and laid out the federal landscape like a surveyor marking corners. 3 separate statutory bases. Fair Housing Act, failure to provide reasonable accommodation, retaliation, discriminatory conduct. ADA, interference with disability rights. Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, particularly relevant given the federal funding the county had provided to the complex's renovation in 2003. Each was independent. Each had its own enforcement teeth. Together they formed something that a certain kind of HOA board member would not enjoy looking at. Marcus filed with HUD on a Monday. He filed a parallel complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division on Wednesday. He kept every receipt, every green card, every timestamp. Priscilla provided the service dog documentation, Kiper's training certification from a licensed program in Columbus, the handler evaluation, 18 months of veterinary records, the letter from Marcus's VA physician. The file was 4 inches thick and organized by date. Devin Kirk was 29 years old and worked for the Ashtabula Star-Beacon, which was a newspaper that had survived 3 rounds of layoffs and still published 5 days a week, which in itself was a small miracle. He had come to Harbour Crest to write about the complex as an example of the city's modest revival. He had been in the parking lot talking to a resident about a landscaping grant when he overheard Cynthia Folt on her phone using the phrase "problem tenant" in a way that made him take out his notebook. He did not publish anything yet. He just kept his notebook. Marcus submitted a FOIA request to the HOA for all board meeting minutes from the previous 2 years. What came back was mostly complete. Mostly. The minutes from the September meeting, the meeting at which the Architectural Uniformity Clause had reportedly been adopted, were missing. In their place was a blank page, with a page number and nothing else. Renee looked at this and said, mildly, "That's interesting." Then he pulled up the Ohio Secretary of State's database and the Ashtabula County Recorder's Office. Amendments to HOA governing documents in Ohio required a supermajority vote and filing with the county recorder within 30 days of adoption. He searched for the filing. There wasn't one. Barbara Chang lived in Unit 6 and was 63 years old and had grown up in Shaker Heights and had very strong opinions about compost and almost no opinions about homeowners associations. She appeared at Marcus's door on a Thursday evening, holding a digital voice recorder the size of a paperback book. "I think I recorded something you should hear," she said. "I was trying to get a recipe from my sister in Tucson. She was supposed to call at 7. The board meeting ran over. I pressed the wrong button." The recording was 38 minutes long. The audio quality was inconsistent. There was a stretch in the middle where someone's chair scraped and drowned out several words, but the relevant section was clear. Cynthia Folt's voice. "We need that structure gone before he has a chance to file anything. We do not need a precedent in this building." A second voice, which Renee later identified from other recordings as Dale Fish. "What about the dog?" "The dog is his personal business. The ramp is ours." A third voice. "Are we sure about the liability here?" Cynthia. "Gerald's looked at it. We're on solid ground." Gerald, from somewhere near the back of the room, in the tone of a man who was very much not on solid ground. "I said it was arguable." Marcus listened to this 3 times. Then he said, "Get me Theodore Bass's number." Theodore Bass was a civil rights attorney in Cleveland who had litigated 11 Fair Housing Act cases in federal court and lost 2 of them, and those 2 he had lost on procedural grounds that he still discussed with the focused displeasure of a man who intended to not make the same mistake again. He listened to the recording, asked Marcus 4 questions, and said he would file within the week. He filed in the Northern District of Ohio. The complaint ran 41 pages. It named Harbour Crest HOA, 3 individual board members, and Lakefront Property Services, LLC. Counts: violation of the Fair Housing Act, violation of the ADA, violation of Section 504, tortious interference with disability accommodations, breach of fiduciary duty, and civil conspiracy. Devin Kirk published his first story the following Monday. It was 1,200 words. It contained no adjectives that weren't necessary. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a brief. Cleveland 19 picked it up that evening. HUD sent its investigator the following week. A woman named Constance Ridley, who wore sensible shoes and carried a briefcase and had the manner of someone who had heard every explanation twice and found all of them wanting. She requested all board records, all correspondence relating to Unit 14, and all financial records for the past 3 fiscal years. It was during this review that someone at HUD ran Cynthia Folt's name through their system. It came back with a flag. Constance Ridley made a phone call to the Detroit field office. Then she made another call to Washington. Then she sat in the Harbour Crest common room for an extra 2 hours reviewing a file that had nothing to do with the current complaint and everything to do with it. Cynthia Folt's name, before 2013, had been Cynthia Harris Folt. She had worked as a licensed real estate agent in Wayne County, Michigan. In 2011, a complaint had been filed against her with the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. A family with a child in a wheelchair had been told 3 times that a particular rental was no longer available, and then watched it sit vacant for 6 months. The case had been closed for insufficient evidence. The file had not been destroyed. Constance Ridley noted this in her report under the heading Pattern of Conduct. The TRO came down on a Tuesday morning. The federal court's temporary restraining order required the HOA to restore a compliant, accessible entry to Unit 14 within 72 hours, at its own expense, and prohibited any further action against Kiper's presence in the building. The order was 2 pages long and used the word immediately 4 times. The contractor arrived the following morning. He was not Todd Greer's nephew. He was a man named Bill Pauley, who had been doing accessible construction for 20 years and who built the ramp 2 inches wider than the original and with a non-slip surface that cost $30 more than the standard material. He did not ask why the job existed. He did excellent work. The subpoena ducis tecum went out to the HOA's bank and to Lakefront Property Services. Discovery took 6 weeks. What it produced? The HOA had paid Lakefront $3,200 for the demolition, not the $1,100 they had billed Marcus. The difference, $2,100, had moved through 2 intermediate accounts before settling in an account held by Todd Greer personally. Bass took the deposition of Cynthia Folt on a gray Wednesday in January, in a conference room in downtown Cleveland with a court reporter and a view of a parking structure. He played the audio recording. He gave her the transcript. He asked her to identify the voice that said, "We need that structure gone before he has a chance to file anything." She said she didn't recognize it. He played it again. She said the context was being misrepresented. He asked her to explain what context would alter the meaning of those words. Her attorney put a hand on her arm. "My client has nothing further to add at this time." Bass made a note and moved to the next exhibit. HUD's formal determination arrived in February. The HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act on 3 separate grounds. The matter was referred to the DOJ with a recommendation of enforcement action. The DOJ's letter to the HOA's counsel offered a consent decree, $195,000 in compensatory damages to Marcus Delaney, $50,000 in civil penalties to the Federal Fair Housing Enforcement Fund, mandatory fair housing training for all board members within 90 days, and an independent compliance monitor for 3 years. The board met. The vote was 4-1 in favor of the consent decree. Cynthia Folt cast the single vote against. She submitted her resignation the following afternoon, by email, with no explanation. The new ramp went in on a Thursday in January, during a break in the snow. Bill Pauley came back to do it. Same crew, same standards. When he was done, he tested it himself, walking up and down twice, then handed Marcus a completion card with his license number on it. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. The lake was about a quarter mile away, invisible but present. The sound of it, the particular quality of cold that came off open water. He could hear Kiper's nails on the new surface, the dog making his preliminary assessment. 68 pounds, Marcus said to no one in particular. Architecturally inconsistent. The check from the consent decree arrived the following week. He set it on the kitchen table while his screen reader confirmed the figure. Then he was quiet for a while. "You know what they spent," he said to Kiper, trying not to spend $3,000 on a ramp. Kiper offered no opinion on this. He was a professional. René Augustin became interim board chair in March, elected unanimously at a meeting he had not campaigned for and had not attended, having been voted in by a show of hands while he was at the mailboxes. Someone slid a note under his door. He read it, went back to his apartment, made coffee, and thought about it for 20 minutes. Then he sent a reply saying he would serve until a proper election could be organized, and that his first action would be to file the Architectural Uniformity Clause amendment correctly with the county recorder, and then to immediately move to suspend it. Priscilla Voigt printed Devin Kirk's article and laminated it. She hung it in her clinic between Kiper's certification and a photograph of the lake in summer. Patients asked about it occasionally. She gave them the short version. Several of them, over the following year, mentioned knowing people who had HOA problems. She gave them René's number. Devin Kirk received the Ohio Associated Press Award for Public Interest Reporting in April. At the ceremony, he thanked his editor, his sources, and, briefly, Barbara Chang, whose inability to operate a digital recorder may have been the most consequential act of accidental journalism in Ashtabula County history. Barbara, who had not attended, later said she still hadn't gotten the recipe. Cynthia Folt listed her unit in May. It sold in 3 weeks, slightly above asking. The buyer was a retired schoolteacher from Youngstown who had 2 cats, both under 25 pounds, and no strong opinions about architectural consistency. Property values in Harbour Crest had risen 4% since Cleveland 19 first aired the story, which was the kind of outcome that a certain type of person would have found deeply ironic if they were still around to see it. On a morning in late March, when the snow had pulled back from the walks and the lake was doing something almost hopeful with the light, Marcus opened the front door of Unit 14 and stepped outside. Kiper went down the ramp ahead of him, hit the bottom, turned left, and stood waiting with the patience of someone who had been doing this his whole life and intended to keep doing it. Marcus followed him down. He stopped at the bottom and stood still for a moment, the cold air off the water finding every seam in his jacket, the sound of the neighborhood organizing itself around him, a car somewhere, a door, a gull very far away. He reached down and touched Kiper's head. They went for their walk. What brought Harbour Crest HOA from a $150 fine to a $245,000 federal consent decree wasn't a dramatic courtroom moment. It was paperwork. Marcus had kept every certified mail receipt, every unanswered deadline, every time-stamped document from day one, because that's what actuaries do. They record, they measure, and they wait for the numbers to speak. The Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act don't require a plaintiff to prove malice. They require proof that a person with a disability was denied a reasonable accommodation, and that the denial was deliberate. The board meeting audio recording confirmed deliberate. The missing county filing confirmed the amendment was legally void. The contractor records confirmed financial misconduct inside the board itself. Each piece alone was a problem. Together, they were a pattern. And a pattern is what triggers a federal investigation rather than a local dispute. The detail that quietly doubled the stakes was Cynthia Folt's prior complaint history, sitting in a HUD field office file since 2011, waiting for a second data point. 1 complaint is an allegation. 2 complaints, separated by a decade and a state line, is evidence of conduct. The HOA spent more money on lawyers than the ramp ever would have cost. That's not irony, that's arithmetic. What would you have done in Marcus's position? Filed the first letter or walked away?